So today is discussion 2, and I'm going to continue with the theme of the women's suffrage movement and the radicalism of the women's suffrage movement by talking about the leader of the radical part of the women's suffrage movement, and that is Alice Paul. Alice Paul was an American suffragist, feminist, and women's rights advocate. And activist. She was one of the main leaders and strategists for the campaign for the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. And Paul, along with Lucy Burns and several others, initiated and strategized events like the women's suffrage procession and the Silent Sentinels. These were ladies who picketed the White House during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. They were part of the campaign that resulted in the passage of the amendment in 1920. As a leader of the National Women's Party, or the NWP, she spent half a century fighting for women's rights and the Equal Rights Amendment. Along the way, she would go to jail for protesting. She would participate in hunger strikes and would help to gain the rights for women across the country and across the races. Without Alice Paul and her leadership and activism, it's very much possible that the 19th Amendment would never have passed. Paul was actually inspired in her fervor and commitment by the fervor and commitment of the British suffragettes and by their aggressive advocacy and tactics and methods. After having heard the speeches at the University of Birmingham given by Christabel Pankhurst and two other suffragettes, she became completely involved in the suffrage movement in Britain. And she describes it as something akin to a religious conversion. She says, "Well, then, I understood everything about what the English militant suffragettes were trying to do." She, and she meant Christabel Pankhurst, and the other young women who spoke with her, they were all three young girls, they had anyway one heart and soul convert. I didn't know how many others they had, but that was myself. While she was studying in England in Britain in 1907, she met Emmeline Pankhurst, which was Christabel's mother, who was also a British suffragette. Miss Pankhurst was one of the most important and radical figures in the English suffrage movement. The British suffragists were very, very radical. They threw rocks, they heckled people, they smashed windows, they burnt buildings to the ground. Alice actually became an assistant to Miss Pankhurst. And when the government arrested and imprisoned them, they would refuse to eat. And so that's kind of where Alice learned her how to conduct a hunger strike. But Alice got sick, and so she returned to the United States in 1910, where she completed her doctorate in sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. And she wrote her dissertation on the legal rights of women in the United States. According to Sylvia Horonick, Paul often acknowledged that her experience with the British feminists had a profound effect on her, and she became immediately involved in the American suffrage movement and joined the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. But her activist experience in England motivated her to argue for a more radical strategy. And she often clashed with the NAWSA leadership over her approach. And eventually this clashing and conflict led Paul and her friend Lucy Burns to leave NAWSA and eventually form the National Women's Party, or the NWP, which is a political party that had federal women's suffrage as its only political plank or political platform. Whereas the NAWSA leaders decided to focus on state-by-state legislation instead of a national amendment. The NWP focused only on a national amendment in any way possible. Both Paul and Burns were excellent strategists and tacticians, and they used various forms of advocacy that they thought would be paramount to the success of the movement. Paul and the NWP organized congressional lobbying and delegations to the White House, along with parades, public meetings, and demonstrations, publicizing what they felt was the injustice of denying women the right to vote. According to Sally Hunter Graham, the inconsistency of Woodrow Wilson's White House, particularly Wilson's advocacy of democracy abroad, and the administration's seeming indifference to democracy at home, led the women of the NWP to begin picketing the White House in 1917, carrying banners, quoting the president's speeches on democracy, and demanding suffrage for American women. The women carried banners that asked, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" Unfortunately, the United States' entrance into World War I led the president and others to believe that women should stop picketing the White House and the president and support the war effort. Alice Paul would not do that. According to Jean Carroll and Amy Joaquin, Alice Paul continued the pickets, arguing that the Wilson administration, while ostensibly fighting the world war to maintain democracy, was preventing 50% of its people from participating in its own democracy. The reaction to their continued efforts was extremely severe. The women were arrested, charged, and sent to the Occoquan workhouse. Many of the women would often be arrested and sent to the workhouse on multiple occasions prior to the amendment's passing. But what got the attention of the president and the nation was Alice Paul's and the others' refusal to eat. The hunger strike. In the article Hungry for Justice by Jean Cornell and Amy Joaquin, they stated that by conducting a hunger strike, Alice got the prison warden's attention and the nation to pay attention to her cause. And they were right. Although it would still take another 2 years to get the amendment through the Senate and passed, and then eventually ratified, the activism and leadership of Alice Paul was an essential element to the movement and the passing of the 19th Amendment.